Madeline Holt, and my guest today is Marianne Leone, who wrote this wonderful book, Ma Speaks Up, A First-Generation Daughter Talks Back. And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that the Cape Cod Writers Center is in its 56th year. We are proud to make Books in the World one of the longest running cable TV shows in the United States. And that's because we have gracious hosts, gracious writers. Marianne Leone has written the story of her relationship with her mother. She is a writer, an actress, a mother, a screenwriter, many roles, and each one has a story. This book is about an Italian-American family and a love-hate relationship. Welcome, Marianne. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Go right ahead. I know that you have a lot to share with us.
Well, you know, when we were thinking of the title of this book, the Ma Speaks Up was what I always wanted, and A First-Generation Daughter Talks Back is apt because it's what I said in confession every week. I talk back to my mother.
Back to my mother.
That was and this kind of explores the nexus, the mother-daughter nexus, and it was especially difficult to me because I really wanted Donna Reed, and I got Anna Magnani when I was a kid. I was really, you know, all around me was the American culture, and I wasn't seeing it in my house, and I felt she was just different, and it was really hard.
It's hard for a kid, especially as a teenager. I think you want everything to be normal and all. Before we go into some of the details, let me just read from one of the reviewers of your book, who happens to be Ann Hood, who is probably well known to most of our audience. And I do like to talk about writers and writing and the writing process. And Ann Hood is another very generous author. She wrote The Knitting Circle, and her most recent book that I've read is called The Book That Matters Most, and it's about a book club and what they read and their relationships. But back to Ma Speaks Up. It's a love song from Marianne Leone to her Italian immigrant mother, equal parts funny, brash, poignant, insightful, sarcastic, joyful, hopeful, and tender. It will make you laugh and cry. It will make you hungry for Ma's lentil soup. It will make you want to hug your own mother. And Marianne and Ma, yes, Ma speaks here, but so does Marianne Leone. And for that, we must shout, grazie mille. and then Andre Dubus said, I can think of a few writers, dead or alive, who can make us laugh out loud in one sentence, only to wipe the tears off our cheeks in the next.
Very sweet.
What sweet things and what enthusiasm for this book. You know, mother-daughter conflicts are probably common in most nationalities. One of the comments that I wrote in my notes to you was, how did you get away with it?
Yeah.
You were nasty.
I was bad. And you know, I didn't totally get away with it. My mother was not a hitter, but she would do the you're dead to me silence that went on way too long. Every once in a while she would pinch, but she, I realized that part of it too was that she probably didn't even understand, you know, some of the more nasty comebacks. You know, you had asked me earlier, did you research this with your brother and sister?
Right.
And you know, I live in Kingston now, and there are girls there that I grew up with. And they remember, and one of them brought up to me, I was so sorry that I heard this afterwards. She said, do you remember when you threatened to turn in your mother as an undesirable alien? See what I mean?
Yeah,
so bad.
Yeah, you were.
But then she wouldn't have gotten what that was, you know?
No, I guess not. Not today she might have if she heard it. Anyway, but when you talk about whether you did research or not, I mean, that brings up the whole subject of writing a memoir. I mean, how do you write a memoir? Do you do it from your own memories, or do you do it from talking to relatives, or?
I did do it from my own memories, and you know, unfortunately, all the older people in my mom's generation are gone. So yes, I talked to my sister, I talked to my brother, who is a poet in his own right, and he wrote me a very funny story, which is his, so I didn't use it. He wrote me a very funny story about a time he hid in the bathroom and got in trouble for saying a bad word about the little girl next door because they were casting Zorro and she made him Sergeant Garcia because he was chunky. But my own memories, I have to say, I remember entire conversations because my mother was, a lot of my friends quoted her because she was very funny in her own way, and I think she knew she was funny.
Yeah.
So,
okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, she was really very attractive too.
Yes.
She must have had a lot of people looking at her and saying, you know, "Hi, Mrs. Leone," or what did they call her?
My friends all called her Ma, like I did.
Yeah.
And you know, she was widowed very young at 43, which it's appalling to think of now. There she is, widowed at 43 with 3 children, no English as a second language, and no real skills outside of cooking. And she still made it work.
Yeah.
You know, she became a cook.
Yeah.
And I admire her so much. And I'm happy that I did admire her when she was still alive. And once I got out of the horrible teen years.
Yeah. I want to start talking a little bit about your mother's story, but before we do that, I found your book interesting in that in a memoir, you don't just start in the beginning and go through her life and your life. You have a way of weaving in some emotional high points, probably, is what, I'm not sure. Maybe you can explain how you...
Well, I think that there's not really an arc to this. There is a little bit of an arc when I talk about, you know, my mom losing my dad and then going on what I just described to you. But in order to write this, because I'm intimidated by long-form prose, I'll be the first to tell you this. I basically made my living as an actor, and I wrote screenplay, and I wrote essay. An essay is less demanding, of course, but it is demanding for some who say, I can't write in that concise.
Yeah.
But what I tell myself is, well, I'm just writing an essay. And then it turns into another essay and another essay and another essay, all on the same topic. And before you know it, you have this book of
memories. And I think that works very well.
Yes. I did that with my first book, too.
Yeah.
Because I admire very much, there's a writer I really love called Abigail Thomas, who also gave me a blurb for this book. And she wrote this book called 3 Dog Life. And it was about, it's a memoir about a subject that what interested me was it's about a subject that is a hard subject. It was about losing the love of her life he had a terrible run over by a car, had a brain concussion, brain damage, and she had to move upstate to be near him. She couldn't take care of him, but yet it was very funny in many of her parts. So, and what she wrote was, it looks like a series of essays. There are certain chapters that are just how to break up a dog fight, for example. And when my agent started sending around my first book, she said, you know, I'm going to send it to 20 publishers, and if 18 of them come back and tell me you can't have this be the way it is, then we're going to have to talk. But luckily the 4th publisher picked up on it. So,
Publishers Beacon Press, and the book is available through all the normal outlets online and in bookstores. So back to your mother's story. There's some really interesting, even from the very beginning, her being sent to America. Right?
Well, she came here to escape fascism and an arranged marriage to someone an old man who was adjoining land. Her father was a fascist. Mussolini was on the rise. War was coming. And the first chapter in the book is called The Official Story, because I maintain that if you are an immigrant, there's the official story and then there's the real story, because you get to reinvent yourself when you come here in a certain way. And there were secrets. My mother had secrets that she didn't reveal to me that I won't reveal to you today, but she did not reveal those secrets until she was 80 or so.
Oh, really? Okay. So we have to keep some of this from the reader so that they can learn about it. But I do have to ask you, when you talk about the official story and the real story, how you looked for the real story and why you thought that she was some kind of an imposter.
Well, what was suspicious to me was that all my aunts and my girlfriend's mothers all had these beautiful swishy wedding gowns and wedding portraits, and there was no wedding portrait of my mother and father. And I interrogated her like someone at a black ops site, but she never answered, and she in fact would get angry if I kept on it too much. So I reveal in the official story how my sleuthing got me to what I thought was the answer, which was that I was adopted, which turned out to not be true. But I don't want to reveal the rest of it because it was interesting.
It's a story. It's a story. That's
it's a story.
For sure. That's for sure. We talked a lot about being Italian. I'm a second generation, and my family background is very similar in many ways. I'm a Bronx girl, Italian Catholic, all that good stuff. Came from a village. My family came from a village very close to yours, actually. It's so funny that we have all this in common. So I asked you to talk about the glamour of being Italian now versus then, and it's something that, I didn't tell you this, but I once asked my father, why do we say Miele? That's our maiden name, and it's a Miele, which is a beautiful word, and all that. And he said, you think it's so nice being Italian now? Well, it wasn't then.
Yeah, so, it's really true. I mean, Italians were considered lower than low. They weren't hired. They were considered dirty. And
so do you want to look at page 39 and read some? You can ad lib if you like, or we can.
Well, I said I wish some of the cachet that Italy has now had been around when I was growing up in the late 50s, early 60s. Now the word Italian evokes sublime food, sophisticated design, and elegant, sexy lifestyles. We who grew up back then were just guineas and dagos and wops, the sons and daughters or grandchildren of impoverished immigrants who narrowly escaped the miseria endemic in the backwater south of Italy, the Mezzogiorno. Southern Italians were parodied endlessly on television, in the movies, and even by our own teachers. My chubby little brother was Tony Spumoni, the ice cream man, in the second grade play. Our parents talked too loudly and ate foreign food that wasn't appreciated then by foodies. It stank of garlic and left embarrassing oily stains on our lunch bags, shameful reminders of why we were greaseballs and could never be real Americans.
Oh, my mother spoke a harsh guttural dialect from her mountain village in Abruzzi. No mellifluous vowels for her. We had a good time talking about how the Italian language is different in different places. And then, I always enjoyed reading this. My mother grunted staccato commands and made my name sound like Marianne.
Marianne.
Marianne. I've been calling you Marianne in my mind for since I read that book. So I'm looking at my notes and saying I'm laughing because I'm looking at the anecdote that has to do with where your mother has the knife in her hand. Do you want to tell that story?
Well, I was this kid who hated food. I was like, the worst nightmare to feed. And plus I had misophonia, which is when other people's chewing gets to you. So I was driven demented by my grandfather slurping or my brother who would torment me by opening his mouth. And so my mother would be cutting the bread, which she held, sawing it like a violinist against her chest, and she would hold up the knife and say, "I got a knife in my hand." She would like threaten me with the knife.
Do the accent. I got a knife in my hand.
I got a knife in my hand.
I got a knife in my hand.
She dropped her H's like a Cockney.
Right. Then we've kind of touched on this about how mothers and daughters spar a lot, and you have a passage here where say daughters were to be sparred with, and why do you think that is? And it comes up in literature and other cultures as well.
I think in my mother's case, I think my mother actually was afraid for me because I was such a weirdo kid reading and just didn't want to play, wanted to sit with a book. She thought she's never going to find a man. She's never going to, do any of the. She thought I was a weird kid, and she couldn't figure out who I was. Not interested in any of the things that would make me a wife. For example, I kept saying I'm never getting married. I'm never going to be like you. It was. I think it's the thing of like I'm not going to be my mother. I'm not going to be my mother. I'm not going to be my mother. And then one day you are your mother, whether or not. And. It started with the fact that my mother was an anti-cleric. Now, my mother and father sent me to Catholic school because they were immigrants, they thought, how good is public school? It's free. You get what you pay for. So they send me to the Catholic school, where I immediately capture bond with the nuns. And now I'm like freaking out because my mother's never going to Mass. Instead, she's making beautiful hand-rolled pasta every Sunday. So basically, it's me standing there saying, you never go to church. And my mother's saying, mothers now have to go to church. Mother's got to make the macaroni. And me saying, but you don't even go to confession. And her saying, hey, I got to tell my sins to some guy. And he's saying, it's not a guy, it's a priest. And her saying, let me tell you about the priest. And then giving me a completely inappropriate story about the priest.
Yes, right.
And it was a problem because my mother had her own religion. She believed in the evil eye. She had her saints, but she didn't go to church and she didn't buy anything the nuns were saying. So I was kind of at odds.
She had the saints' statues, and when she
had all the saints, and when they didn't deliver on a lottery number, they got turned to the wall.
She turned the saints.
That's right.
And the other thing about your mother is that she was a bookie.
She booked numbers for the local wise guys. She did. They all knew her. And she was right at home with those guys, too.
Oh, she was a character.
She was really a character. Her wake was amazing. I mean, it was like she was the queen of... I grew up in this area of Newton that is, believe it or not, a working class area. It's called the Lake. It was Nonantum. Everybody is from the same village in Italy. They're all from San Donato Valdicomino. They paint the Italian flag colors down the middle of the street. They carry the Virgin during the festa every year. And so... it was an enclave. It was really an Italian-American enclave. There were Italians, Irish, and a few French Canadians, basically.
Well, before we leave the subject of your mother's food and on Sunday and how much you loved the pasta, for a person who didn't like to eat, you certainly did
the
like
pasta.
the pasta.
I made an exception. Yeah.
And this story has to do with the religious practice of not eating meat on Friday, and why don't you tell the story about
I was such a fussy kid, but the one thing I really liked was she made this beautiful lentil soup, on Fridays that was a meatless lentil soup. And that was the one thing I would eat because it had her beautiful hand-cut noodles, it had lentils, it was okay by the church because there was no meat, or so I thought. And I never asked her for the recipe, and I became a cook in my own right. And then years later, after I lost my mother, that first year, I was in Naples with some friends, and we went into this little hole-in-the-wall restaurant, Caffè Nanella, if you ever go to Naples. Amazing. And I got the lentil soup, and I surprised everyone at my table by bursting into tears when I took my first bite because it was my mother's soup. It was the soup of all those Fridays, those meatless Fridays. And my friend Maggie, who was across the table, I said, this is it. This is the soup I never could make. And she said, let me taste it. And she tasted it. She said, you know why you never could make it? There's meat in the soup. And the minute she said it, it was as if she had resurrected my mother. I could hear her say, hey, what did the priest know about make a soup? I put the meat in, I take it out, and now it's a soup you can eat on Friday. And there it was, right there. And I just never saw it.
Oh, my, that is another hysterical story. God didn't require mothers to go to Mass on Sunday. That was funny. Your father, talk about your father a little bit, and the sad part of the story.
My dad died young. My dad was 50 years old when he died, and he was one of these sun kings. He was one of these big, handsome men who lit up the room when he came in, and it was a love match with he and my mother even, and it's wonderful to grow up in a household where there is a love match happening, and also, I think I was saying to you earlier, I really feel grateful to have been raised by these strong but tender men because it showed me what to look for in a man. And but he died young, and my mother was bereft. I mean, bereft. He owned a bar, my dad, and I never worried about my bars. My dad getting into heaven when I worried about my mother missing Mass because I thought God will let him in. He's because he was so personable and funny and lovely. But he died really young at 50.
Yeah,
so.
And then your mother had to go on, and she worked in a restaurant, and
she worked in a restaurant where there were a lot of wise guys in the restaurant, guys with names like Fifi and Gogo, and they all loved her because she was cooking. She was delivering home cooking, and she was at home. She was at home in that.
Your father's funeral, there was some interaction between your mother and the nuns?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I can't say what she really said, but that was a culture clash. I mean, we're all devastated, but you know, my mother and my aunt and my uncle and everyone, they were reacting culturally the way people in the old country react, which means they were fainting, they were screaming, I was just mute with horror and terror and fear. And my teachers came, the nuns, and it was the first time I'd ever seen them be like not harsh, but they went up to my mother, who was, you know, barely even sentient, and they took her hand and said, God needed him in heaven. And my mother came back to life from being half comatose and said, F God, I need him here. At which point I thought, oh my God, these are my teachers. I couldn't believe she said it to them. But at the same time, now, years later, I kind of see where she was coming from. This was some kind of treacly palliative that was meaningless to a person that devastated. So, but at the time I thought, oh.
Speaking of inappropriate language, there is a wonderful anecdote about your in-laws coming for dinner at your house, and we haven't talked about the fact that your husband is Chris Cooper, who's an actor and who is very American.
Yes.
Has played cowboys and
pioneer stock.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things I really loved about your comments was that he fell in love with you because you are so exotic compared to, and so your Italian background is something that he really enjoys.
I also say it was the pasta con vongole that I made for him the first time, for a guy who grew up on Velveeta and fish sticks, you know. So, I mean, the first Christmas at his family's house was frightening. It was, first of all, his dad was a doctor, so we drove up. It was a national monument. I was horrified when I saw that, and I immediately felt insecure and started using trisyllabic words. And his mother grandly took us through this house that looked like Versailles, and my family called and said, take pictures. And I thought, I don't know if his mother would appreciate me documenting the house like an insurance adjuster, but the food was, I just starved the whole time I was there, because his mother, I gotta say, I mean, she was...
But then you got married and you didn't really involve your family too much at that point.
No, we basically eloped, and then we were starving actors living in New York in a 6th-floor walk-up. But at one point, Chris was working in England, and I was home for a random visit, and I got a call from his mother saying that they were in Boston to see a doctor about Chris's dad, and I had to invite them to dinner, so I had to immediately grab my mother and say, don't say the F word to the Coopers. And she shrugged me off and then produced this fantastic meal. They came. My entire family was intimidated. My mother was groveling before Chris's mother, who was tall and blonde and gorgeous, and saying, you're so beautiful, you know. And the father was, you know, chowing down on the lasagna. Everybody was happy. I thought, oh, thank God, we got through the meal okay. And then I was making coffee in the kitchen, and I hear, no, no. My mother is suddenly channeling Anna Magnani again. And when I want to die, I die, she says to Chris's father. And I hear him saying, now, Linda, you can't just, no. And so they're arguing about euthanasia. And Ma actually won the debate on euthanasia in the end. And
so it went off. You got away with it.
Yeah.
They went, they came, they went.
Yeah.
Oh my. So we are coming to the last few minutes of our time together. Is there anything that you, well, first of all, I did want to tell people that you wrote another book about your son, Jesse, and I don't know if you'd like to say, would you like to say a few words about that?
Yes, that was my first novel. Was about, memoir was about Jesse, and it was about, you know, our son was 17 when he died suddenly. He was born prematurely. He had severe cerebral palsy, and he's the reason we're living here. We moved back to Massachusetts because they had better inclusion than New York or New Jersey. And then the one town we moved to did not have great inclusion, so I had to organize all the parents and get rid of the SPED director and get him to go to school, and never mess with an Italian mother. My son went to school and was an honor student. and wrote poetry. And so that book, I know it seems like it might be a sad book, but it wasn't. It was, I wanted there to be humor in the book because Jessie was always the kid who got the joke at the table before anyone else.
That's nice. I know you've done a lot of work on the cause of inclusion, and I wanted you to talk to this audience about that book, because if they go and look you up, they probably should buy both books because they both are. I didn't read Jessie, but I'm going to, and your
well, we started an
great.
advocacy fund in his name at the Federation for Children with Special Needs for parents of low income and for whom English is a second language, because I always picture my mom sitting in on one of those meetings and trying to get her words across and how challenging that is. So, and now I'm working on a book about our rescues.
About your rescues?
To rescue our badass Bichons.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Lucky and Frenchie.
Okay. Just before we leave the subject of Jessie, there's a very touching scene in your book where you realize that first of all, you're a little concerned that your mother is going to somehow find fault with you because of your son. And then she embraces him.
That's right.
That's right. With the ferocity, like, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And she, I think in some ways they had a special bond too, because of her difficulties with language, and Jessie was nonverbal. There was somehow a bond between them that was a beautiful bond. They would lie together on his bed listening to Italian folk tales together.
Goodness.
It was beautiful. Yeah.
So did your mother know how you felt about her?
Yes.
Before she died.
Yes, absolutely.
You
absolutely.
did make it through, and
we made it through the horrible teen years. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure I have a feeling you weren't as bad as you think you were. And I want to thank you for coming. And if there's anything else you'd like to say, this is just
I know this is for writers, so don't be afraid to trick yourself the way I do to write and say, I'm just writing an essay.
Just writing an essay, yeah. Well, there are a lot of people writing memoirs on the Cape on some wonderful subjects, and be encouraged and be brave. And I think it takes some bravery.
And I studied with Grub Street when I first did it, and I recommend them. They have online courses.
Good, good. Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Marianne, for coming. It's been delightful.
Thanks, Madeline.
We have had so many nice conversations, and I really appreciate
Maddalena, grazie.
Mille, grazie mille. Thank you so much.